Good morning, dear friends. Welcome to our Some TV broadcast. I want to wish all of you a wonderful holiday season. May the Lord bless you and keep you as we conclude this year, and may He bless you abundantly in the year that will soon begin. Today, we are going to allude to the story of the birth of Christ, but we're going to do it in a different way. During the first half of the presentation, you're probably going to wonder, how does this sermon have anything to do with the birth of the Savior? But in the second half of the sermon, you're going to see the reason why I have approached this in the way that I am. First of all, we want to have a word of prayer, so I invite you to bow your heads with me as we ask the Lord's guidance. Father in heaven, we come before you, who are the awesome God, the omniscient God, the all-knowing God, to request that you will be with us as we open your word today. We ask that it will not return unto you void, but that it will cause the impact for which you sent it. We thank you for the promise of your presence, and we claim that promise in the precious and holy name of Jesus. Amen. I want to begin by reading several verses from the book of Isaiah, chapter 46, and verses 9 through 11. These verses give us the reason why God is distinguished from all false pretenders. The reason is that God is omniscient. God knows, since eternity past, everything that was going to transpire in the history of this world, in the minutest detail. So let's read Isaiah 46 and begin at verse 9. Remember the former things of old. Here God is speaking. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. Now, why can God say there is no other, and there is no one like me? Verse 10 has the answer. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel from a far country. Indeed, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it. Powerful series of verses. What distinguishes the true God from all false pretenders is the fact that the true God knows the end from the beginning. He knows in the minutest detail everything that has transpired, is transpiring, and will transpire in the history of this universe. God is omniscient. God is all-knowing. For eternity, He has known in the minutest detail what we ourselves call history. God did not arbitrarily predetermine how history will flow, but rather God laid out a plan, taking into account that Satan would put roadblocks and detours along the way. God does not predetermine, but rather outmaneuvers Satan, because God has known from eternity past every move that Satan is going to make in the course of history. I want to read a statement by Ellen White that is found in Education, page 173, where Ellen White describes God's guidance of history. This is how it reads. In the annals of human history, the growth of nations, the rise and fall of empires, appear, that's a key word, appear to depend on the will and prowess of man. The shaping of events seems, once again, a very important word, seems to a great degree to be determined by man's power, ambition, or caprice. But in the Word of God, the curtain is drawn aside, and we behold behind, above, and through all the play and counterplay of human interests and power and passions, the agencies of the All-Merciful One, silently, patiently working out the counsels of his own will. What a powerful statement. It might appear that history is in disarray, that there's no law and order, that no one is guiding it. But Ellen White in this statement speaks about the drawing aside of the curtain, and we are able to discern behind, above, and through the play and counterplay of human interests and power and passions, how God works silently, patiently, for the counsels of his will to be fulfilled. The word counsels means his plans, for his plans to be fulfilled. Ellen White's reference in this statement to the play and counterplay of history awakens the idea of a game, because in a game you have play and counterplay. Thus, we can compare the movements of history with a game of chess, where the movement of the pieces on the board represents the events of history. As the game advances, each player attempts to frustrate the moves of the other player. As the game advances, of course, the purpose is to put the other player at checkmate. The strategic chess game between Christ and Satan is not a mere game. It is, so to speak, for all the marbles. Who will win this game of history in the counter play and the play of the events of history? Who is going to be the winner? The good news is that in the play and counterplay of historical events, God has a distinct advantage over Satan, because God knows how the game will end before it begins. God knows all of the moves that Satan is going to make in human history, all the detours, all the roadblocks, and so God can maneuver to work through Satan's interference in the events of history. How would you like to play a game of chess if you knew all the moves that the other player was going to make before the game actually begins? How much of a chance would there be that you could lose? It would be impossible if you knew all of the moves that the other player was going to make. God makes no mistakes in his management of history, because he already knows from before the beginning of the game all the moves that Satan will make. And therefore God can move to counteract the movements of Satan in history. For this reason, it is impossible for God to lose in this very serious game of history. On the other hand, Satan has to guess how God is going to move. And when you have to guess, you make mistakes. And so Satan makes mistakes in the course of human history. Now let's talk about God's concept of time in contrast to our concept of time. For us time-bound creatures, that which has been and that which will be are two different things. What has been done is past, and what will be done in our mind is future. However, God is not time-bound such as we are. That which is potential and future for us is actually present for God, because God lives in an eternal present. That is to say, things exist in the mind of God before they come into actual existence for us. Acts chapter 15 and verse 18 describes the eternal foreknowledge of God. This is a very short verse. It says that God's acts are known from eternity. This is how it reads. Known to God from eternity are all his works. So God already knows how he has to work in the course of history to counteract Satan's moves. Although time is important for God, he, in contrast to us, lives, as it were, in an eternal present. Because he knows the end from the beginning, nothing takes God by surprise. After all, he is the great I am, not the great I was or the great I will be, but a God who is the I am, the eternal present. Now let's unpack this a little more by going to the book of Exodus, chapter 3, and we'll read verse 6, and then we'll read verses 13 and 14. Of course, the context of this is when Moses goes to the burning bush, and the burning bush is not consumed. And here God is going to speak to Moses from the bush to tell him that he is going to be the instrument in the deliverance of Israel from bondage in Egypt. Now, a very important detail is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whom God is going to refer to from the burning bush to Moses, had already been dead for over 2 centuries. That's an important detail we need to remember. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had already been dead for over 2 centuries when God approached Moses at the burning bush. So let's read Exodus chapter 3 and verse 6. Moreover, he said, here God is speaking, the angel of the Lord, who is another name for Jesus, moreover, he said, I am, notice that, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now there's something very interesting here. God isn't saying, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob while they were alive. For God, it was like they were alive at that very moment, because God says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So let's go back again. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, not I was. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now let's go down to verse 13, and we'll read verse 13 and 14. Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Notice the name that God addresses himself by. I am. And he says it here in 2 different ways. I am who I am. And then later on in verse 14, he says, I am has sent me to you. Now, Ellen White had a very incisive comment about God's concept of time. God is not bound by time. God lives in an eternal present. Notice this statement that we find in Manuscript Releases, volume 14, pages 22 and 23. This is a powerful statement. She's going to define what I am means. This is how it reads. I am means an eternal presence. We do not live in an eternal presence, but God does. I am means an eternal presence. And then she states, the past, present, and future are alike to God. Now, they're not alike for us, folks. We can distinguish the past, the present, and the future. But Ellen White explains, I am means an eternal presence. The past, present, and future are alike to God. He sees the most remote events of past history and the far distant future with as clear a vision as we do those things that are transpiring daily. So God sees the broad scope of history, if we can call it past history, present history, and future history. How can you say that eternity has to do with history? Because history has to do with past events. But for God, past events, present events, and future events are seen in a broad sweep as if they are transpiring right now before our eyes. God does not look at the flow of time in segments, but rather in a continuous flow. God does not look at history and prophecy as what has happened and what will happen, but rather in a continuous present flow. This is impossible for us to fathom, of course, because we are not God. Although from our perspective, going back to the passage in Exodus 3, from our perspective, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were already dead when God spoke to Moses. They were alive according to God, because He is the I Am who lives in an eternal present. So having spoken about God's omniscience and how God can maneuver history because He knows exactly all of the moves that Satan is going to make throughout the course of history, and He's known it since before sin came into the universe, God cannot lose in the very serious game of what we call history. Now let's take a biblical example of how events of history were orchestrated by God to prepare the way for the coming of Jesus the Messiah. This is where we transition somewhat to the issue of the coming of the Messiah. An example of Satan's miscalculations in history is the 400-year prophecy that we find in Genesis chapter 15 and verses 13 through 15. We're going to give a summary of what those verses say, and then we're going to read them. God told Abraham, while he still lived in Canaan, that his descendants were going to be strangers in a land that was not theirs for 400 years, after which they would return to the land of Canaan. A very notable detail in this passage in Genesis 15 is that God did not identify the land where they were going to sojourn. God did not identify the name of the land where they would go, then to return later to Canaan. When Satan influenced Joseph's brothers to sell him as a slave to Egypt, little did Satan realize he was actually helping God's plan to be fulfilled in the course of history, God's plan to bring the Messiah into the world. God knows the end from the beginning, and therefore, beforehand, He can frustrate Satan's moves in the course of history because Satan makes mistakes. Now let's read that passage in Genesis 15, verses 12 through 16. It says there that Abraham has a very terrifying dream, which is really describing symbolically the captivity of Israel in Egypt. It says there, "Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror, and a great darkness fell upon him." This is speaking about the 400 years. He continues saying in verse 13, "Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs." Notice that God did not identify the land. Very important. God did not want to give away His hand. And so it says, "Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. But the news is good news, and also the nation whom they will serve I will judge. Afterward they," that is God's people, "shall come out with great possessions." And then God says to Abram, you don't have to worry about this because you're going to die before it happens. Verse 15, "Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age." But then he goes to the future. "But in the fourth generation, they shall return here." In other words, they're going to return from the place where I will send them back to Canaan, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now let's talk a little about the play and counterplay that took place with Joseph and his family in Egypt. His life is a good illustration of the play and counterplay of human history and how God always has the upper hand, particularly to bring the Messiah into the world. Now, the life of Joseph seems to be filled with injustices, but we're going to see a pattern of how God is working to fulfill His plan in contradiction to the moves that Satan is making. As you know, Joseph was given two dreams, where his parents and his brothers would come and bow before him. Now, this went over like a lead balloon in the minds of his brothers, and they hated Joseph because of his dreams. And therefore, Satan works upon the brothers of Joseph to sell him as a slave to Egypt. Little did Satan realize that by that act, where he was guessing what God was going to do, was going to lead to the fulfillment of God's promise in Genesis chapter 15. So Joseph was sold to Egypt. Of course, he was sold by his brothers, influenced by Satan. Their hatred was influenced by Satan. See, Joseph was a good kid, and Satan thought, it's not convenient for me to keep this young man around. So when he sells him to Egypt, he says, problem solved. As Joseph was on his way to Egypt, the caravan of the Ishmaelites, he was terrified about what the future held. But as he could see in the distance the tents of his father, he made up his mind that he was going to cooperate with God. He could not understand how his dreams would be fulfilled, how his brothers would come and bow before him. But he decided that he would trust in the Lord and he would follow God's plan to a T, even though he didn't know where it was leading. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 214, we find these words. His, that is Joseph's, soul thrilled with the high resolve to prove himself true to God. Under all circumstances, to act as became a subject of the King of Heaven. He would serve the Lord with undivided heart. He would meet the trials of his lot with fortitude and perform every duty with fidelity. So notice, with an undivided heart, Joseph said, I don't know where this is leading. I don't know how my dreams will be fulfilled, but I'm going to walk with the Lord. He knows the end from the beginning. He must have a plan, and I'm going to follow that plan. Joseph had no idea how what happened to him would fulfill God's almighty plan. So Joseph ends up in the house of Potiphar. It was not an accident that he ended up in the house of Potiphar. God already knew it. And God said, good idea. Why? Because Joseph had to learn to be a good administrator, because he was going to administrate some very important things in the future. He was going to save Egypt and the surrounding nations from death, from famine. And so he ends up in the house of Potiphar. He becomes an outstanding administrator. He's even made like the head of the house. And Potiphar only worried about the food that was on the table for him. But then the plan seems to take a turn downward, because Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of wanting to rape her. And so now Joseph ends up in prison. You say, wow, what a raw deal. He ends up in prison. He was a good boy. He was faithful in the house of Potiphar. So he's getting a raw deal. But God had a plan. God's plan was, first of all, for him to fine-tune his administrative skills in the prison, and that he did. He almost became the warden because the warden entrusted the prison to him. So he fine-tuned his administrative skills. But the main purpose why he ended up in prison is because he had to meet a baker and he had to meet a cupbearer. There had to be a providential meeting. Did God know this already from eternity past? Of course God knew from eternity past. So God is maneuvering. Satan is working for Potiphar's wife to land Joseph in prison, but God says, okay, I'll have a plan B now. I'll maneuver around what Satan is doing. So he has this providential meeting with Pharaoh's cupbearer. And then, of course, God gives a dream to the baker and a dream to the cupbearer. And Joseph interprets the dreams. Joseph says to the baker, in 3 days, you're going to be history. And he said to the cupbearer, you're going to get out of prison and you are going to serve the wine for Pharaoh once again. And that's exactly what happened. The cupbearer was called out of prison once again to serve the wine of Pharaoh. Now, you would expect the cupbearer immediately to go out and say, a man named Joseph interpreted my dream, and that's why I ended up serving wine again. But he didn't. He forgot for 2 years to say anything about Joseph. And the reason is it was not in God's plan. I believe that God gave him an attack of amnesia so that he would not remember for 2 years what Joseph had done because it wasn't time yet. So you know the story. I'm not going to tell you the entire story of Joseph. But then God gives Pharaoh 2 dreams. And the 2 dreams are that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, and that provision needs to be made during the 7 years of plenty. Did God know that that Satan was going to cause 7 years of famine? And did God preempt what Satan was going to do? Of course. This is how we have to look at history, folks. We have to look at history as a play and counterplay. God knowing what Satan is going to do and God maneuvering the detours and the roadblocks that Satan is putting in the way. So now Joseph is called when Pharaoh has his dreams because his experts can't tell him what the dreams mean. And Joseph interprets the dreams. And Pharaoh says, who better than Joseph to serve as prime minister of Egypt? And so from a foreign slave, Joseph now becomes the prime minister of Egypt, second in command after Pharaoh. The story isn't over. Now Satan causes a drought in the Holy Land because the drought reached beyond Egypt. And the family of Jacob, after 2 years, is suffering from hunger. And so Jacob says, I've heard that there's food in Egypt, and he sends his sons down to Egypt. Joseph still doesn't know how his dreams are going to be fulfilled. But when his brothers arrive in Egypt, they bow before Joseph. And Joseph is probably smiling inside to himself, saying, God has a sense of humor. Now I can see, as I look back, how God maneuvered everything to counteract Satan so that I could occupy this position. Now, the brothers come to Egypt and they bow before Joseph. And to make a long story short, Joseph becomes the prime minister of Egypt, and he brings Jacob and his family down to Egypt. At this point, Satan probably still doesn't know that God has outmaneuvered him. He hasn't realized that by transporting Jacob and his family to Egypt, that eventually Jacob and his family were going to become that nation that would go back to the promised land. And perhaps Satan did know, and he's saying, I made a mistake. Now, there's something more to this, and that is that Jacob and his family transferred to Egypt for a very special reason. God had said that he was going to transport them to the land of Egypt. He didn't say to the land of Egypt, but of course, Abraham probably knew that it was Egypt, even though God did not identify the nation. He had told him that they were going to spend 400 years where they were transferred to, and then afterwards they were going to return to the promised land. Now the question is, why would God send them to Egypt? Why not simply leave them in the Holy Land without Joseph having to go through this serious and severe suffering? I want to read from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 232. Ellen White gives a reason why God felt it necessary to transfer Jacob and his family to Egypt, where they would spend 400 years. God had a plan. He did not leave them in the Holy Land because he knew some things that were very instrumental. It says there in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 232, the assurance to Abraham, fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will make thee a great nation. The promise had been given to Abraham of a posterity numberless as the stars. God had promised Abraham a numberless posterity. But as yet, the chosen people had increased, but slowly. And the land of Canaan now offered no field for the development of such a nation as had been foretold. In other words, the great nation that would come from Abraham, the situation in Canaan was not ideal for that to happen. She continues, it was in the possession of powerful heathen tribes that were not to be dispossessed until the fourth generation. If the descendants of Israel were here to become a numerous people, they must either drive out the inhabitants of the land, which they couldn't do because there were a few, or the second option, disperse themselves among the heathen. So they could try and fight those nations, but they were at a great disadvantage because there were a few. They hadn't grown into a great nation. And the second reason that Ellen White gives is that if they dispersed among the nations, something very severe would happen. The statement continues, the former, according to the divine arrangement, they could not do. And should they mingle with the Canaanites, they would be in danger of being seduced into idolatry. In other words, they would intermingle with the nations of Canaan, which were later expelled, and they would lose their identity as God's chosen people. So once again, I go back a little bit. Egypt, however, offered the conditions necessary for the fulfillment of the divine purpose. A section of the country, well-watered and fertile, was open to them there, affording every advantage for their speedy increase. So God knew that they were going to settle in the land of Goshen, which was ideal for them to grow into a large nation. Once again, a section of the country, well-watered and fertile, was open to them there, affording every advantage for their speedy increase. And the antipathy they must encounter in Egypt on account of their occupation, for every shepherd was an abomination to the Egyptians, would enable them to remain a distinct and separate people and would thus serve to shut them out from participation in the idolatry of Egypt. How wise God was. He said, in Canaan, can't leave them there. If they mingle with the nations, they'll lose their identity. And if they try to fight those nations, they're going to lose because the nations are more powerful than they. So I'll ship them off to Egypt, where the Egyptians will put them in a separate land because they don't like shepherds, and that way they can grow into a great nation. And that's exactly what happened. And what took place 400 years later? 400 years later, they went back to the land of Canaan. Now the question is, did Satan fiercely fight against Israel leaving Egypt and going back to Canaan? Of course he did. He says, I blew it. I didn't understand how God was maneuvering in history. I put a roadblock, another roadblock, but God went around it and he maneuvered around it. He says, now I can't let them go back to Canaan. God was in control of the situation. Now, I want to just mention here something that is very, very important in our discussion here. Because of what God did in the days of Joseph, the situation was prepared that made it possible for the Messiah to come into the world. Do you know that it was Satan's plan to starve the holy seed from which the Messiah would come? You say, really? Yes, Satan had an ulterior purpose. He knew that God was going to bring the Messiah into the world because he could read Bible prophecy. And so Satan says, I am not going to allow that to happen. I am going to cause this drought, because Satan has control over the weather patterns insofar as God allows it. He said, I'm going to cause this drought, and I'm going to starve the seed from which the seed will come to death. Let me read Genesis 45, verses 6 through 8. Genesis 45 and verses 6 through 8, where 3 times Joseph tells his brothers not to cry because of what they did, because God had a plan. And the plan had to do with the posterity. I read beginning Genesis 45, verse 6. Joseph says to his brothers, but now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. First time now. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Now it continues. For these 2 years, the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. Second time now. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity. That's the second time. In other words, so that your seed will survive, so that your posterity would survive. And then it continues, verse 7. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So, now comes the third time. So, now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me. Notice he's realizing God is doing this. He's countering Satan's moves. So once again, so now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Now let's fast forward to the days of Jesus Christ. Did God already know everything that was going to happen? The 400 years, the promise to Abraham, what took place with Joseph and Jacob and his family, the return to Canaan. Did God already know all of that before it even transpired? Actually, from the days of eternity, of course God knew. Did he know how Satan was going to move? Of course he knew how Satan was going to move. So could God interrupt Satan's plans by establishing a plan that would actually go aside from what Satan was planning to do? Of course, God could do that. Now let's go to Acts chapter 2, verses 22 and 23. Did God already know everything that was going to happen from the birth of Christ till his death on the cross? And even beyond that, his resurrection, Pentecost, what he's doing in heaven, the fact that he's going to sit on his throne forever. Of course, God already knew all of that. Notice Acts chapter 2 and verses 22 and 23. Here Peter is speaking and he says, Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know. Verse 23 is the key verse. Him, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death. Was the crucifixion of Christ a surprise for God? Of course it wasn't. It says he was delivered by the determined purpose. It's not that God determined it that way, but God had a purpose. And he said, Satan is going to do this, but I'm going to bring something good out of it. So once again, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge, that's an important word of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death. I like two other translations that explain the meaning of verse 23. The New Century Version reads like this: but this was God's plan, which he had made long ago. He knew all this would happen. So this was God's plan. He knew it was going to happen. He knew it from long ago. He knew how Satan was going to work. And throughout the ministry of Christ, God took many steps to counteract what Satan was trying to do. The New Living Translation also has a better way of understanding this. It says, but God knew, the word prognosis, God knew what would happen. And his prearranged plan was carried out when Jesus was betrayed. God had a prearranged plan to counteract Satan's moves. I want to read a remarkable statement from the book Desire of Ages, page 147, where the Father and the Son, in eternity past, before sin even entered the universe, they sat down and they choreographed what would happen during the life of Jesus on earth. When I say they choreographed it according to what they knew would be the working of Satan. Notice this statement. Here Ellen White is discussing the meaning of the expression that Jesus used many times during his ministry, mine hour is not yet come. The words mine hour is not yet come point to the fact that every act of Christ's life on earth was in fulfillment of the plan that had existed from the days of eternity. Wow, that's an amazing statement. Every act of Christ's life on earth was in fulfillment of the plan that had existed from the days of eternity. Before he came to the earth, the plan lay out before him, that is before Christ, perfect in all its details. It was a detailed plan because God already knew everything that was going to transpire. And so you say, oh, well, while Jesus walked on earth, he had access to the total plan. He knew he wasn't going to fail because he had before him all the plan. No. Notice how the statement continues. But as Jesus walked among men, he was guided step by step by the Father's will. He did not hesitate to act at the appointed time. With the same submission, he waited until the time had come. While Jesus was on earth, he did not have access to the total plan. While he was on earth, his Father told him, this is a plan for today. And he said, this is the plan for tomorrow. God, the Father, guided him as to the steps that he needed to take. And so the trials of Jesus on earth were very, very genuine to him because he did not have access to the total plan that he had before he came. Another statement in Ministry of Healing, page 479, tells us this: Christ, in his life on earth, made no plans for himself. He accepted God's plans for him. And day by day, the Father unfolded his plans. So there's no possibility from the Father's perspective that the plan would fail, because the Father already knew that his Son would follow his will. Now for Jesus, it was a different story. His trial was very real because he did not have access to the total plan. In Gethsemane, his suffering was genuine. On the cross, when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was a very real trial for him. He would have failed if he had chosen to go against the plan, but he decided to follow the plan to a T. Now, I want to dwell for a few moments on the word foreknowledge. You notice in verse 23 of Acts 2, it says, him, Jesus, being delivered by the determined purpose, in other words, the purpose that he knew beforehand, and foreknowledge of God. The word foreknowledge there is the word prognosis. Very interesting word. We use that word in English, prognosis. What is a prognosis? Well, a prognosis is, for example, when you go to the doctor does some tests, and the doctor will give you a prognosis based on those tests. He might say, I've determined that you have a massive cancer and that you have 6 months to live. I would hope that that would not be the message, but that could be the message. The doctor could say, this is just a small issue. With this medication, it can be resolved. Now, let me ask you, is the prognosis of the medical doctor absolute? No, it's not absolute. Why not? Because he can't see the end from the beginning. He is applying a calculated guess based on the test. But God's prognosis is not like that. God already knows what the result is going to be. He doesn't have to surmise what it's going to be. Let me give you another example. The case of weathercasters. It's very interesting that weathercasters make a good salary, even though probably around 50% of the time they're wrong in their prognostications. Maybe it's a little less than 50%. Do they give a prognosis of what the weather is going to be like, say, next week? Of course they give a prognosis. What is the prognosis based on? It's based on what they look at on their instruments. But are they wrong frequently in their prognosis? Of course they are, because they cannot see the end from the beginning. But when God gives a prognosis, you can take it to the bank because God knows the end from the beginning. The Father, even though He suffered when Jesus went through Gethsemane, when Jesus hung on the cross and cried out, "Why have you forsaken me?" The Father suffered as He saw this transpiring. The Father knew, because He has eternal foreknowledge. He knew that Jesus was going to gain the victory in the end. Now, do you know that there are probably 100 explicit prophecies regarding the Messiah that we find in the New Testament, quoting verses from the Old Testament? Let me just mention several of those, and I'll only do it in passing. God announced that John the Baptist was going to be the precursor of the Messiah. Matthew 3, verse 3, quoting Isaiah 40, verses 1 to 3. Also, in Matthew 11, verse 10, quoting Malachi 3, verse 1, John the Baptist was going to be the messenger of the Lord. Numbers 24, verse 17, quoted in Matthew 2, verse 2, tells us that the birth of Jesus would be announced by a star. Isaiah 7:14, quoted in Matthew 1:22, tells us that Jesus would be born of a virgin. Micah 5, verse 2, quoted in Matthew 2 and verse 5, tells us that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem of Judea. Micah chapter 5, verse 2 speaks of the eternal pre-existence of Christ, which is echoing Exodus 3, where Jesus says, "I am that I am." Leviticus 12, verse 3 said that the Messiah would be circumcised on the 8th day. Luke 2, verse 22 to 24 tells us that that's exactly what transpired with Jesus. Hosea 11, verse 1 tells us that Jesus would find refuge in Egypt. That is quoted in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15, that out of Egypt I called my son. Jeremiah 31, verse 15 predicted that infants would be slain when Jesus the Messiah would be born. That is quoted in Matthew 2 and verse 17, referring to the massacre of infants by King Herod. Daniel 9, 24 to 27 actually gives us the chronology of the baptism of Jesus, the death of Christ, and the close of probation for the Jewish theocracy, the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Isaiah 9, verses 1 and 2 describes the words that Jesus would speak at the beginning of His ministry. And of course, That's quoted in Matthew 4, verses 14 through 16. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15, predicted that a prophet like Moses, but greater than Moses, would arise. That's quoted in several places that we find in the New Testament. John 6, verse 14. John 7, verse 40. Acts 3, 18 to 22. The stone that the builders rejected. I could continue, reading these promises that I have placed in my notes. Let me just give you a few more. The stone that the builders rejected, I mentioned. That he would read the scriptures in Nazareth. Isaiah 61, 1 and 2, which explains the ministry of Christ. The purpose of his ministry is actually quoted in Luke 4, verse 21, where he unfurled the scroll and read the passage from the book of Isaiah. Jesus is the servant of the Lord that is prophesied in Isaiah chapter 53. The sign of Jonah. Jonah 1, verse 17, 3 days and 3 nights, quoted in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40. One greater than Solomon's temple. Matthew 12, verse 42. The fact that the Messiah would speak in parables. Isaiah 6, 9, and 10, quoted in Matthew 13, 14, and 15. That people would honor Jesus with their lips while their hearts would be far from him. That comes from Isaiah 29 and verse 13, quoted in Matthew chapter 15, verses 8 and 9. That Jesus would enter into Jerusalem on a donkey. Zechariah verse 9, quoted in Matthew 21, verses 4 and 5. The words of the children at the triumphal entry, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's found in Zechariah 9, verse 9, quoted in John 12 and verse 15. The cleansing of the temple. The stone that was rejected, the 2 commandments, that he would sit at the right hand of the Father. The ladder that Jacob saw is Jesus, according to John 1:51. That the shepherd would be stricken and the sheep would be scattered. That comes from Zechariah 13, verse 7, quoted in Matthew 26, verse 31. That he would be sold for 30 pieces of silver. I'm not even going to mention the verses. Somebody wants this, you can request all of these prophecies that I've written down. That they would cast lots for his garments. That he would cry out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? His substitutionary atonement, Isaiah 53. That he would be numbered with transgressors. That the zeal for God's house would consume him. That he was the serpent that was raised in the wilderness. He's the living manna, the water from the rock. The betrayal of Jesus was predicted as well. That he would be hated without cause. That he would say on the cross, I thirst. That he would be given vinegar to drink. That no bones would be broken. That they would look upon whom they had pierced. That he would rest in the grave and his body would not see corruption. That he would sit at the Father's right hand. And even the chronology of his death, burial, and resurrection were all contemplated before. Now let me close by reading the conclusion of the statement that I mentioned in Ministry of Healing, page 479. Christ in his life on earth made no plans for himself. He accepted God's plans for him, and day by day the Father unfolded his plans. Then comes this. So should we depend upon God, that our lives may be the simple outworking of his will. As we commit our ways to him, he will direct our steps. So folks, as we close this presentation, God has a plan for us. Will we, like Jesus, cooperate with God's plan? As we begin a new year very, very soon, let us pray to the Lord to give us the strength to make commitments to him where we will follow his plan no matter what, as Jesus followed his Father's plan. Because ultimately, Father knows best. Father has had an eternity of experience. There might be detours, there might be difficulties and problems, but let's follow God's plan. May God bless us and keep us, and may this be our commitment to the Lord.